The evidence for the Kushites. 2. The theory that the Kushite Egyptian army rebuffed the Assyrians requires the following premise: that after the Battle of El Teke, the army posed a credible threat to the invaders. Otherwise, Sennacherib would have no reason to depart. In order to demonstrate that the Kushite Egyptian forces were fully capable of intimidating Sennacherib, the burden is on me to show that these forces were fairly close by and strong. By close, I mean that in order to have rescued Jerusalem, the 25th dynasty soldiers would have had to be actively pressing the Assyrians. They were not necessarily engaging them in battle. As we have seen, Sennacherib claims to have inflicted defeat on the Kushite Egyptian troops on the plain of El Teke, the only recorded battle between the Kushite Egyptian forces and the Assyrians in 701. On the basis of the annals' telltale omission, many scholars have given reasonable grounds for doubting that the imperial army thrashed the southerners. The pharaonic troops may thus have had the capacity to regroup. Yet, for the argument's sake, let's be skeptical of that assumption. Even if one were to accept the extreme case scenario and assume that Sennacherib had utterly whipped the Kushite Egyptian forces present in El Teke, it would not follow that Kushite Egyptian forces everywhere would be neutralized. Leading specialists on Egypt and Judah agreed that the Kushite Egyptian forces were probably divided into two contingents. They draw this conclusion from Sennacherib's peculiar wording when describing the adversary at El Teke. Although his annals states that the Kushite pharaoh had supplied many, if not most, of the army's elite soldiers, it did not clearly say who commanded the force. From a close reading of the document, these scholars infer that the monarch of the Delta, those whom the annal called the kings of Egypt, may have been in charge. If Kushite royalty really had been present, the scholars assumed that Sennacherib would have said so. Combining this assumption that Taharqa was absent from El Teke with the Bible's statement that Taharqa was at the head of the advancing forces, they deduced that Taharqa's contingent had to be different from the one at El Teke. This reasoning suits my purposes nicely, but it's not compelling. Sennacherib's uncertain phraseology provides only wobbly evidence of the existence of two Kushite Egyptian forces. Fortunately, a simple way exists to tell whether the unit that Sennacherib describes at El Teke was different from the Taharqa-led contingent of the Second Kings. The Rabshakeh, according to Second Kings, mocked the besieged Jerusalemites for believing an Egyptian army, presumably the same unit that the Second Kings later identifies as Taharqas, would rescue them. To know whether one or two units existed, we need to know the timing of the Rabshakeh's speech. Did it come before or after the Battle of El Teke? The Bible makes no mention of El Teke, so the answer is not immediately apparent. And the Assyrian envoy's remarks preceded the El Teke fight, it could mean that the army the Jerusalemites so yearned for was the same one that Sennacherib would soon confront at El Teke, weaken, and, if not outright defeat. The battle's unsuccessful outcome then would have foiled Hezekiah's plans of continuing to wait for the unit's arrival at Jerusalem to drive off the besiegers. If, however, the speech came after the clash of El Teke, the Rabshakeh would have been referring to another contingent sent by the 25th dynasty. It is quite clear that the Rabshakeh call for a surrender does come after the clash of El Teke. Sennacherib's annals offers a clue. It describes the main Assyrian forces' line of march within Kor as going north to south, from Phoenicia to Philistia, and then on into Judah. The itinerary means the El Teke action had to come before the Lachish siege, since El Teke, more than 20 miles north, would have been on the way to Lachish. The Bible provides another clue. Although it never alludes to El Teke, 2 Kings states that Sennacherib dispatched the Rabshakeh from Lachish to King Hezekiah at Jerusalem. Emphasis added. Hezekiah was therefore pinning his hopes on the arrival of a force from Egypt that was distinct from the one that saw action in El Teke. The sequence bolsters the two contingent theory conclusively. Of course, we start from a different premise and assume the Kushite Egyptian force actually fared quite well at El Teke. Then the force that the Jerusalemites were hoping for could have been essentially the same as which had fought at El Teke. A more fundamental question, what evidence exists to show the units advancing on Jerusalem was not impotent, a weak reed in the Rabshakeh's word, and that it was both strong and close by. How can we be sure that Kenneth Kitchen, a believer in the two-unit theory, is wrong when he says the second body under Taharka's command discreetly retreated to Egypt after realizing that the Assyrians had regrouped after El Teke and were too powerful? To answer this question, Herodotus is of help. Despite its confusion on some elements, his account of Sennacherib's invasion makes clear that the Kushites were not shirking a fight, and were very close indeed to the Assyrians in the invasion's decisive moment. Herodotus says the Kushite king obeyed the dream in which his god urged him to march boldly to meet the Assyrians. Then, in describing the conflict's outcome, the account amplifies on this dauntlessness, as he, the king, lay here facing the Assyrians. Thousands of field mice swarmed over them during the night, and ate their quivers and their bowstrings and the leather handles of their shields. And so that on the following day, having no arms to fight, they abandoned their position and suffered severe losses during the retreat. Emphasis added. Let us not be distracted by the odd folk image of the rampaging rodents. For other purposes, what is important is that this historian of the 5th century BC depicts the Kushite-Egyptian forces on the very eve of the showdown as anticipating an all-out battle. It is also important that Herodotus states that the next day the Kushite-Egyptian army was in hot pursuit of the retreating enemy. The details, such as whether, as implied, all this took place in 24 hours, are not what matters. As in so much other secondary information in Herodotus' account, the details could be wrong. What does matter is that the account's thrust presents the Kushites as active, assertive, resolute. The book of 2 Kings contains two vivid passages that, although widely separate, have much in common. Both refer to the events of 701. Both cite Yahweh as vowing to save Jerusalem from the Assyrians. Both deal with Sennacherib's invasion in a manner that subordinates it to theology, making it hard for us to tell where the history ends and the theology begins. Both were composed long after the invasion. Ronald Clements, for one, dates them to the 6th century BC. The two passages, then, are good examples of prediction that are made after the event, a characteristic of many of the books of Isaiah's prophecies. In Isaiah 31, 8-9, Yahweh is speaking. The pronoun him refers to Assyria. And Assyria shall fly by the sword, not of man. A sword which is not human will devour him, and he will flee away from that sword. He will flee away before the sword, and his young men shall be enslaved. His rock, the emperor, will slip away through terror, and his officers desert the battle flag in panic. A few lines earlier in V4, the biblical writer has said that Yahweh himself will fight Zion's attackers. In this context, it is quite clear that in saying that a sword not wielded by humans will defeat Assyria, the passage is indicating that only Yahweh can save Yahweh's own people. That explains why at a time of composition, probably corresponding to that of the B2 segment, the writers cannot come out and say that a human army is what saved the day. This passage is pertinent to my contention that Taharka's army was both strong and pressing. First, the passage's military motif is plain. What causes the Assyrians to leave is not a disease, a distant crisis, or Hezekiah's surrender, but rather war, as symbolized by the sword. Second, the turning point is abrupt. Soldiers drop their banners and run. Again, the idea of a sudden terrorized flight does not fit any of the rival theories. These, of course, are precisely the same elements that we encounter in Herodotus. The other text, Isaiah chapter 14, verses 24-25, also pictures Yahweh as triumphant over Assyria. Yahweh of hosts has sworn, saying, as I have planned, so shall it be. As I have purposed, it shall happen, that I will break Assyria in my land, and I will tread him down on my mountains. Then his yoke shall depart from them, and his burden shall leave their shoulders. To describe the invader's fate, this passage too employs a vocabulary of violence. It is the divine will to break the enemy and to tread him down. Some translations use trample. Such word suits neither the surrender theory nor the troublesome elsewhere theory. After all, an invader who departs after accepting a victim's capitulation or who dashes off to attend to a distant rebellion can hardly be shattered or crushed. As for the epidemic, theory, the action of treading down or trampling is not imagery normally associated with a devastating disease. As armies and pestilence may both ravage and destroy, but only armies stop. The original Hebrew word is also revealing. The word tread, which describes the action against the Assyrians, contains the same root, bis, as the word used to describe the Kushite nation in Isaiah 8, chapter 18, verse 7, a nation that is sturdy and treadeth down. In Isaiah 18, 2, the word also describes the Kushites. The passage's vocabulary is short, fits the Kushite rescue theory precisely. Both passages are consistent with Herodotus and lend themselves far more to military success against the Assyrians than to any explanation for the invaders' withdrawal. We have biblical evidence then that the 25th dynasty could have had reinforcements in Judah in the weeks after the Battle of El-Teke, and that these troops were in position to pose a real, not just vaguely theoretical, threat to Assyrians. Indeed, the language of the book of Isaiah invokes the flight of the Assyrians under conditions of duress. The book does not, however, actually identify these invaders' pursuers, much less acknowledge that they were human. Let us for a moment put aside the evidence in 2 Kings and Herodotus and ask the question, who could possibly be these pursuers in the book of Isaiah? Could they have been Jerusalemite forces? No. The original Isaiah elsewhere emphasizes the city's passivity, and neither Sennacherib nor 2 Kings makes any mention of Jerusalemites' combativeness. Could they have been a Judahite force still in the countryside? No, none of the primary sources alludes to any resistance by them. It is reasonable to assume that the Assyrian conquest of the 46 strong points had effectively crushed whatever Judahite forces might have existed outside Jerusalem. Could the pursuers be Philistines or Phoenicians? No, Sennacherib had already long since overcome them, or, as in the case of Tyre's besieged forces, neutralized them. Could they have been troops from the neighboring kingdom of the Transjordan, Moab, Ammon, or Edom? No, even if they had original members of the rebellion, and there is no evidence that they had been, even if they had been original members of the rebellion, and there's no evidence that they have been, it is indisputable that these small kingdoms had demonstrated their loyalty to Assyria well before the siege of Jerusalem had begun. The process of elimination then leaves us with just one lone candidate for the role of pursuer in Isaiah's scenario. The Kushite Egyptian army. No other force could credibly have been in the right place at the right time. If the Kushites did turn back the Assyrian army from Judah, why don't we have in-hand records of their achievement in either Kush or Egypt? The pharaohs, after all, commonly left stelae, murals, or the records of their military feats. A case in point in P.A. Stela that recounts the conquest of Egypt. Wouldn't it stand to reason that such pictorial or textual evidence could exist for a successful campaign in Judah? Three developments could account for the absence of a pictorial or textual evidence. In the course of the 7th century BC, the Assyrians under Esarhaddon and then Ashurbanipal repeatedly invaded Egypt, smashing much of its physical magnificence. In the 25th dynasty may well have produced inscriptions or records. One logical place for it to have been displayed, these would have been in the traditional capital of Lower Egypt, Memphis, where Taharka had a royal residence after he became pharaoh, but nothing remained of the 25th dynasty's physical legacy to the city in 671 after Sennacherib's son Esarhaddon dealt with it. Quote, I destroyed it, tore down its walls, burnt it down, to say of Memphis. Thebes, as the Kushites' spiritual home in Egypt, was another likely place to leave records of feats achieved in Ammon's name, but the subsequent Assyrian sack of the city reduced many of its monuments to rubble. The Assyrians would have taken particular care to obliterate whatever evidence they found referring to their own galing setbacks at the hands of the 25th dynasty. As mentioned, the 26th dynasty manifested a special animosity towards Kush. That dynasty, of course, was composed of descendants of the same Delta lords whom Pa had defeated in 728 and Shabako in 712. Descendants' resentments towards the Southerners was abiding. Enmity appears to have climaxed during the reign of Psamtik II, 595 to 589 BC, says Laszlo Toruk. The year 593 BC seems to mark the beginning of tense relations. The intensity of anti-Kushite propaganda in Egypt may now be judged from the meticulous executed erasure of the names of the 25th dynasty rulers throughout Egypt and of this especially Kushite details of the crowns in representations of the Ethiopian kings on temple walls restored or erected by them. In other words, most of whatever remaining evidence in Egypt that the Assyrians might have missed in the 7th century BC, the 26th dynasty might well have finished off in the 6th. As for the physical evidence of Kush itself, Psamtik invaded Kush, and some scholars believe his troops went as far upriver as the capital, Napata, wrecking much of it. Centuries later, a Roman army did likewise, while P.A. Stela of his conquest of Egypt was discovered in relatively good condition at Napata in 1862. On the whole, Kush's monuments have survived invasions and elements far less successfully than Egypt's. Napata's remains today are bare bones in the extreme, made of a soft variety of sandstone, the only building material within hundreds of miles. They continue to deteriorate in the wind-driven sands. Aside from the craggy beauty of the sacred mountain Gebel Barkal and several steep-sided pyramids, little remains of the Kushites' great capital. From the sandy wastes emerge the stumps of massive columns and almost nothing else. By comparison, shattered Thebes today seems positively robust. The modern world has also been inconsiderate. Completed in 1902, the original Aswan Dam, flooded what had been thriving Kushite territory on the banks of the Nile without a prior survey of monuments and other archaeological objects. A few years later, the dam was raised, inundating still more Kushite vestiges. Finally, completed in 1970, came the much larger Aswan High Dam, Egypt's preeminent development project of the 20th century. Stretching 1.5 miles across the Nile, the dam had created a lake that extends southward 300 miles. It has submerged much of Lower Nubia's Kushite remains in the Nile Valley, both in Egypt and Sudan. While the dam was still under construction, UNESCO sponsored an ambitious operation to rescue ancient buildings and statuary artifacts and other remains. Archaeological teams from many countries joined in an effort which was optimistically named the International Campaign to Save the Monuments of Nubia. The campaign's world-famous success was moving the imposing New Kingdom temples of Abu Simbel, including 4 colossal statues of Ramses II, to an elevation well above that of the new lake. But while the campaign saved almost all of the high-profile glories, it was far less diligent in excavating and rescuing less dramatic vestiges. At an international conference held in 1994 to mark the 30th anniversary of the campaign, the evaluation of the work was harsh. A prominent member of the original Scandinavian team, Torgny Save Suderbeg, said that UNESCO gave an inferior standard of attention to ancient vestiges of Sudan's side of the border. Speaking with regret, he recalled that a number of sites were not found, and were left out of the program, or only partly investigated. As the water rose, an incalculable number of cemeteries, towns, and other remains were simply left in the ground. What we can conclude is that the artificial lake's obstruction to Further digs, the spotty nature of the excavation, particularly in Sudan, and the failure of many archaeologists to make public whatever they did find, have left our knowledge of many aspects of the region's history far, far more deficient than it ought to be.